Welcome to a live discussion on international education with a well-known voice in the field, Dr. Fanta Aw of American University. I'll wait for a few moments for everyone to connect, and then we will start. All right. Today, we have participants from around the world, such as Morocco, Spain, Canada, Sri Lanka, Italy, Norway, and Argentina. In addition to representatives from the local embassies, the US Department of State, American institutions, and the organizations. I am Senem Bakar, Director of International Student and Scholar Services at American University. In the next hour, we will hear from our esteemed speaker on the topic, when she will also respond to your questions. You can use the Q&A function to start, putting in your questions if you want. We will end the program promptly at 1 p.m. Fanta, thank you so much for joining us today. International education is celebrated throughout the world, and this is part of our American University, celebration. And we are grateful that you are here. International Education Week also is a joint initiative by the US Department of State and Department of Education to acknowledge and celebrate the contributions of international education to the world peace. So yesterday, the week started with the Open Doors data release, as you know, and the data release talks about international student flow to the United States, as well as international student flow around the world. What we heard yesterday was that during the 2020-21 period, and new enrollments dropped considerably by 45%, I should say, due to COVID-19. We also heard that based on the IIA Open Door Fall 21 snapshot survey, new enrollments actually increased considerably. That is by 68%. That's wonderful news. In addition, the global mobility, that's for students who study outside of their countries, increased from 2.1 million in 1999 to 6.1 million in 2019. While COVID pandemic negatively impacted the student flow around the world, the desire to study abroad, especially in the United States, is still very strong. To discuss the benefits of and the motivation for international education, I would like the audience to first get to know you a little bit more. So if you allow me, I have a few questions to start with. Sure. Have you attended primary through high school where you were born? Tell us a bit about the younger student, Fanta, please.
Wow, that's a great question, but certainly takes me back many, many years to my childhood. And what I would say is that I was born in Mali, West Africa. But at the age of 7, we left Mali to go and lived in Liberia. And so I actually went to a French international school, a French school, and then came to Washington and we again continued to a French school and then continued. So I'm what you would call a typical global nomad because of my father's occupation. And so I'm very much the product of an international education since the age of 7. And so that's a little bit about who I am in terms of the education that I've gotten from childhood on. And then I decided that after that, it was time to change educational systems for a myriad of reasons and came to the American system and actually came to American University. So not only am I a product of an international education, I'm a product of American University in Washington, D.C. as well. So that's been the journey that I would say, Senem, that I've traveled. And so first and foremost, I wanted to really just say to all of the audience, happy International Week. It is wonderful to see that the State Department and the US government has established at least a week to really recognize, celebrate, and honor the value of international education. And I would say not only just in the United States, but around the world. And so for those of us who I think have gotten the privilege of getting that type of education, there is no doubt that it has been incredibly formative to who I am and to what I've learned and how I see the world as a result of that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I would like to remind the audience that, I do not talk about Fanta's background, but we made sure to put the link to her profile in the Q&A box. So please go ahead and read that in your time. My next question to you, how did your global nomad background prepare you for college and also for careers? If you can maybe give us some examples from that.
Well, I would say my international education background probably prepared me in two ways. One would be adaptability. You learn as a young child when you've had to move around a lot. You've had to adapt to new school systems, make new friendships and all of that. You learn very quickly how to embrace change and how to not only not be afraid of change, but to really embrace change. So I would say that's one of the things that my international education has helped me do, is to learn to embrace change and to adapt. The second thing that it has helped me do as well is to be curious. Because you have the benefit of interacting with people from literally around the world, you become more curious about ways of life, cultures, history, geography. It no longer becomes things that are just static for you. When you hear someone and you're engaging with someone from another part of the world, you both realize your common humanity, but you also realize what the differences are, and that those differences are not things to be feared, but in fact, things to understand that it actually enhances our own experience. And I would say that's the piece that I've learned as well, is really to be curious and to understand our shared humanity and our shared identity. That's on a personal level in my engagement. On a professional level, I think what international education really has taught me is that, in fact, the world is so interdependent that anything that happens in one part of the world, we may not see that as isolated, but we have to understand what are those interdependencies. And so that's been probably what I've learned from a career perspective. And I think as a result, it's actually reflected even in what I decided to study. I often say to people, it's not unusual, particularly with the US education system. I studied business. I learned a lot from there, but I had the opportunity to then move to do something in public administration, which stretched my mind differently, and then had the ability to pivot from that to study sociology. People would often say, what are the connection point between business, public administration, and sociology?
Yes, I would like to ask that.
And what I would say the connection point is really to understand how systems and practices are, right? Is to understand both from a human perspective, how do organizations function? What is the role of business in everyday lives? It's those types of things. And then particularly what you learn from sociology is you learn about both systems and agency. And so for me, those are not disparate parts, but it's really, to me, what is the important value of interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary learning.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to start with the organizational, understanding. Right? You are known for your passion for diversity. In addition to being the vice president for Campus Life, that's the name for student services at American University, you are also responsible for diversity and inclusion. And just recently you have another responsibility on top of that, which is undergraduate enrollment management. Could you talk a little bit about diversity in the context of international education? What should decision makers want to know about achieving and maintaining international diversity? And also, of course, why is international education so critical in today's world? I know I asked a lot of things, but
I think it's an important question. And I think, the irony of this, Senem, is that I will say that I actually began to understand and appreciate the importance of diversity in international education. As you very well know in your role, we get to work with students and scholars from all around the world. And I think there's a misconception that when we say international students as if it's a monolithic group, and it's not.
Yeah.
We have students from all around the world. We have students who come and study in all different disciplines. We have students from all different socioeconomic background, gender identity, religious differences, and so forth. So I would actually say that my first foray into diversity was really in international education itself. And so the ability to then be able to take that into more of the connection of the domestic to the global has been one of the things that I've probably enjoyed most, is that connection point. So that would be the starting point. The second piece is that I would say that diversity is essential to international education. Just on a more basic level, there is no doubt that a classroom where you have diverse perspective is a better learning environment for all. And so our ability to be able to bring in international students from different parts of the world, who even could be from the same country, but they come from different geographical parts of the country. They may speak different languages as a result of that, come from different educational systems, even within one country. And so our ability to bring a diverse group of students together, whether domestic or international, I would argue makes for better learning for all. So that's one of the essential pieces, I think, of diversity in work. The second part is we live in a global economy. And so the ability for any student who's getting educated today in this 21st century, in order to be really more of an educated citizen of any nation, needs to be one that has a global outlook. And so the ability for American students to have opportunities to engage with international students from around the world enriches their learning and enriches the learning of international students. So I would say it's not nice to have. It is essential to a 21st century education, frankly. And I would say for students who would not be able to have the benefit of that, particularly in a place like the United States, I would argue that they've been cheated out of an education. It's an incomplete education today. And every issue that you touch today, whether it's climate change, whether it's poverty, every issue that you touch today has in many ways a global dimension to it. And we need to make sure that our students are exposed to a global dimension of it and are not thinking about things in isolation. And COVID is a perfect example of a global phenomenon that has had global impact, for example.
Yes, especially considering the US study abroad rate being still, below 5%.
Absolutely.
It's critical that we bring those perspectives to a typical US classroom.
Absolutely.
Right.
We see the numbers for study abroad, before COVID, they continued to certainly go up, but we see that there's such disparities among institutions. Some institutions, maybe they have 10% of their domestic students who study abroad. And so the ability of those students to, in many ways, have interactions with, study with students from other parts of the world, in many ways expand their global learning in a way that I think is critically important. And so there's real value in internationalization at home. And also in the case of the US, with the number of immigrant communities that exist here, not only do students have an opportunity to learn from international students, but they have an opportunity to learn from immigrant communities that are here in many parts of our cities and our states as well.
Thank you. According to the Open Doors data, international student numbers in the United States declined by 15% in 2020-21. This data is based on about 3,000 American institutions. I also would like to add that out of the 860 surveyed, institutions in fall 2021, new enrollments are higher, which we earlier talked about, but only 40% of those institutions surveyed for fall 2021 reported increases. In addition, when we look at the enrollment breakdown, about 75% of international students are enrolled in doctoral institutions, like ours, American University, where the decrease was 13%. Master institutions enroll 12% of the international, students. The drop was 23%. And associate degree granting institutions, large community colleges, They enroll 7% of all international students, where the decrease was even more, 24%. Finally, only baccalaureate granting institutions enroll 3% of all international students, where the decrease was 14%. So while the pandemic may have played the most significant role, right, in enrollment drop, it seems like the situation will not get better soon enough for most institutions to turn the numbers around. So although I am excited about 68% increase, that's not across the board. Right? So my question to you is a follow-up, is twofold. What should institutions plan for the short term to increase international enrollments, or at least prevent further drops in numbers? And the second question is, how do you see the trajectory for international education in 5 years or more? We can continue. I had some other questions.
Well, I mean, I think as your data illustrates, international education is stratified within our educational systems, right? I don't think it's an accident that doctoral institution benefited the most from the growth, and that the same way that our community colleges and others probably, experienced really, some major losses. And what I would say is that first and foremost, institutions should not retreat now from international education. I know that there is a tendency, given that we're in the middle of a pandemic and we're in the middle of a crisis, I think the default is to often say, well, you know what, because we're in the middle of a pandemic, we're going to slow down. This would be, I would actually really urge institutions to do the exact opposite. We have to actually double down for two reasons. One is that the pandemic has shown how vulnerable we can be to mobility patterns. And so for the institutions that are really investing even more in international education, they know that in order to see the benefits of that, it's going to take a couple of years. It's not going to rebound by next year. So you have to really be working at this over a period of time. Because first and foremost, students have so many choices. They have so many choices. And that's the beauty of it. They have a lot of choices and options. So none of our institutions can be complacent in thinking that, well, you know what? We've had our name out there and we've had a legacy, and therefore students are just going to continue to come to us. No, they're not. They're going to make the choices that benefits more of what their needs are. And we need to be able to articulate more than ever the value proposition of international education and why our institutions. So that's my first and most important advice to everyone. This is the time to double down, not the time to retreat. Second, we have to have a strategic approach to it. We need to be able to have curriculum, and we need to take advantage of the changes we were forced to do during COVID to really broaden our perspective and our ability to think about international education more broadly. I think we need to be thinking about hybrid learning. And we need to be thinking about shorter term curriculum, certifications and certificates, in addition to what are standard degrees. This is an opportunity, I think, for good disruption in higher education. And I think international education can serve as a barometer for how we can do that differently.
I'm so glad that you just mentioned that, because I heard a similar thing at the most recent Education USA conference. I think it was on November 2nd. And there were regional directors mentioning very much of the same thing, that shorter programs, certificates, hybrid models, definitely, but also utilizing your partners, your alumni.
Absolutely.
Wherever you are looking at in the world,
Absolutely.
are critical.
Yeah, because I mean, when you think about your partners and you think about your alumni, they're in fact your ambassadors, right?
Absolutely.
They're your ambassadors. And in many ways, they're representation of how your institution in many ways either excelled and what's the, what are the career outcomes?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
After folks have graduated with their degrees.
Absolutely.
And so our ability, I think, to do more work on international alumni cultivation and alumni relations is actually even more pressing now for many institutions who have been in international education for a period of time. And so I am hopeful, because the numbers have rebounded, but this is not the time to be complacent.
Yeah. Thank you. I think the rest of my question was, you kind of answered that, but I'm going to go ahead and pose that. Could you identify specific current or future factors that may impact the global mobility trends, including the student flow to the United States specifically?
I would say a couple of things that I'm just thinking out loud. One is that geopolitics really do matter. We cannot underestimate the role of geopolitics in mobility. And so that's one aspect, right? I think relations among nation states really does affect flow. And we saw that with the United States during our election period. We saw what happened in 2016. We saw what happened as a result of changes in 2020, and we still are down that road. And I don't think it's just unique to the United States. I think you can see similar phenomenon in Europe and Asia as well. And so I do think geopolitics plays an important part. That is another reason why diversification is so important. You can't put all your eggs in one basket. So that's one piece. The second thing that I would say is incredibly important is the economic situation. I've been thinking a lot about inflation, and as we're seeing in the US, and I think there will be global inflation. And that does in many ways impact the cost of education to middle-class families. And so that is another question that I think will come up for institutions writ large. If we want to compete for global talent, which international education is really about when it comes to nation states, we have to figure out cost containment issues and cost containment for our families. We have to be able to figure out what is the value proposition of an education in one country versus another, and then also different fields of study. And so those are things we're going to have to pay attention to, are the economic indicators that we have. And then the third component is demographic, right? Nation states where you have a youth bulge and where there's still tremendous capacity for education, particularly secondary education, and where there's not necessarily the infrastructure, we will always see families and students looking elsewhere for those opportunities. And I think this is one of the main staples of international education, is its resilience. Absolutely. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, we were very concerned about, will it bounce back? And I kept saying, I'm hopeful, because we've seen throughout many periods and many milestones, international education does rebound. And part of that is because folks understand why higher education is so important to mobility and how it's so important to just well-being and so forth. And there is an appetite for more education, but that education needs to be probably different today than it was 10 years ago. And this is why I think short-term degrees, looking at new areas of emphasis of degree components, looking at different modalities, looking at different partnerships becomes really important, because the more options and choices that we offer, the more then competitive it becomes. Excellent.
I also heard that about 67% of students are in the United States, back in the United States, right? But in their decision-making, the number one factor is health and safety.
Absolutely.
Followed by other things. But one interesting, change that I noticed, Fanta, that international students traditionally did not put much emphasis on finances. But right now it's kind of climbing up. That goes along with, yes, the COVID impact, yes, the inflation, a lot of other things, of course, but that's something to keep in mind, I guess, for the future.
And I would say in the case of the US, cost has been a challenge for a long time. And I think when you then combine that with issues of inflation, with the economic condition around the world, then it becomes even more pronounced as a result of that. And so I think in particular for the United States, our ability to really pay attention to cost and cost of education will continue to be, I think, one of the challenges that we'll continue to face.
And that's where I understand that you're putting an emphasis on hybrid learning, maybe.
Yes.
As a way to deal with that.
We have to look at hybrid learning, and we also have to look at the role of employers, right?
Absolutely.
Because the other thing that I think employers are finding out is, as they're continuing to grow their workforce, as they're continuing to think about, what is ahead for the next 5 or 10 years, what they often understand is they need to continue to build the knowledge and skills of their workforce. And higher education has an important role to play.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right, my next question is, I'm turning the table a little bit from institution to students, right? Students, especially, students who went through their high school education mostly from home because of COVID, it's a different group of students we are looking at. Yes, they are probably more resilient for many reasons, but what would you tell a prospective international student, whether it's undergraduate or graduate, right, about United States education? Why would they want to come here? We just talked about costs, right? And then I'm going to say, maybe, why should they come to our institution? So,
yeah. No, I think it's a fair question. I think this piece of why would you want to study in the United States when you have so many options? And, Senem, the same reason that brought me here 35 plus years ago still are the same reasons that I would cite today. I think a unique feature of the American education system is experiential learning. You learn by doing. And there's something to be said about that, even more so now. I have seen a generation that is hungry for change. I've seen a generation that wants to be able to be more involved with applied learning. And so that's one of the things that the American educational system affords you. While you learn, you apply that learning, and then that becomes an important part of your overall education. So I would say experiential learning is central to that. The other piece about it as well is the fact that you come into an educational system with tremendous flexibility. As I said to you, I came in, I did my undergraduate studies in business, and then went and did a master's in a completely different field. The ability to actually be able to major, double major and minor and so forth, and to have your undergraduate in one field and your graduate degree in a completely different field is not something that is customary in many other educational systems. So the flexibility piece, I think, is another really important part of the learning and what happens. The third part has to do with the diversity. Diversity is incredibly important in the 21st century education, as we've talked about. The fact that you can literally be in an institution, in a classroom with people with completely different perspective from yours, not only gives you the ability to think more broadly, but to think in more nuanced and complex ways. That's a third reason for why I think this comes up for me. And then lastly, the educational system here is vast. Do you want a liberal arts degree? Do you want a doctoral program? Do you want a community college? What part of the country? Do you want the West Coast, the East Coast, etc.? So the ability is such a large educational system that there's a lot of choice. And I think choice is another component of that. So why American University? I think our location matters tremendously. We are a laboratory for what the world is and is thinking about, right? We are not only have a hub for business, but also for politics. We have a hub for science as well. So I would say this is an incredibly fascinating city. It's a city that is not perfect by any means, but no global city is. So this is a laboratory for learning, and a laboratory for what I would say learning in the 21st century. Lastly, the size of the institution. We're not too big, we're not too small. And we actually have a campus. And not only a campus, an arboretum. So for those who are concerned about safety and the feeling of home, I think the ability to be on a campus, as many of us, I think as international students often see in brochure and others, you're able to actually find your way because the size of the campus is incredibly manageable. You can be in the city within 10 minutes, but then you can find yourself completely in a more urban area. And so that vitality of being in Washington, I think, is another piece. And then lastly, we have 4 seasons.
Yes.
I know people laugh at this, but as someone who came from a part of the world where we had literally 2 seasons, rainy season and dry season, to be able to be at a time like now where you see the foliage change and all of that, and the 4 seasons, there's something to be said about that as well.
Exactly.
So yeah.
Thank you. Fanta, we received some questions
Mhm.
from the audience as
Mhm.
part of registration. If you don't mind, I'll go ahead and ask them.
Sure,
And then we will open the floor to live questions from the participants.
absolutely.
So the first question is, it's actually a request. Please expand on intersections and limitations of internationalization and DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, initiatives for US campuses.
Great. I think that's a really important question.
Yeah.
One of the things I've always argued is that there's really a false dichotomy between
Mhm.
diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as we think about internationalization, people tend to think of diversity, equity, and inclusion as a domestic focus and internationalization as a global focus.
Mhm.
And I often say you can't parcel them that way, right? So I actually, one of the things that I've enjoyed in my work is being able to think about the intersection of those areas of work. Because as I said, I really learned about D&I really from international, from starting with the international piece. So it is my aspiration to say that we need to move away from these false dichotomies. And we, in fact, need to really figure out what are the structures that we need to put in place so that when we think of internationalization, we understand that internationalization cannot happen outside of the context of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the same way when we think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, 21st century, particularly in a place, in a country like the US, that is a country of immigrant, we can't think about DEI without thinking about the internationalization part of it. And in this case, specifically internationalization at home.
Yeah. Thank you. The second question comes all the way from Iowa. What is the future of international education in the United States?
I would say the future is bright, but it is not going to be even. Not every institution is going to benefit from internationalization. As we saw from the data, right? The doctoral institutions versus the community colleges and everything. But the reason why I say it's bright is because, yes, our overall share of international students has decreased over this period of time, but it's actually healthy. That there should be more for everyone. By the same token, I do think that there will continue to be, for the foreseeable future, a real interest and a real desire from families to want to send their students to the United States. For all the reasons that I cited about what's the value of an American education, I think those values are still very strong. And in that sense, I'm very hopeful. However, institutions as a whole, and I would say the United States, even government, needs to put in place an international strategy. We need an international strategy.
Very good. Thank you. I just wanted to say something earlier when you were talking about the reasons why, US study is important, experiential learning. I wanted to back that up with data actually from DHS in this case. I was looking at that the other day. In 2008, 24,000 employment authorization, the number was issued to international students. In 2018, can you guess? 186,000. There is more actually. And then what's even more interesting is that in 2008, only about 25% of them was used. Students actually worked. Right now, it is more than 90%. So you're absolutely right. Students are no longer coming to just for our classroom education, but the experiential piece. As long as United States leads in innovation, that's going to grow even more.
Absolutely. And I think the number you've cited, Senem, is compelling also about the fact that employers understand the value of international education.
Yes, absolutely.
Because many of them have global partnerships. And what better than to have students who not only understand the system here, but understand the system back in their home country. That is a tremendous benefit and a tremendous advantage. And I think that is also being amplified by the way the employers think about this experience as well.
Thank you, Fanta. Now I am going to open up the floor for live questions, and I see that there are so many questions. So I'll try.
That's one of the things I love about our colleagues in international education.
I'll try to read them to you. The first question is, Learning from COVID,
Mhm.
what other options for comprehensive internationalization other than mobility
Mhm.
can we focus on to improve students' access to global perspectives? Perhaps increasing international virtual educational experiences, which you kind of touched on, but if you can elaborate a little bit.
Absolutely. I think the idea that the only way you can develop an international perspective is to physically move is something we need to evolve in our perspective of learning. Virtual learning, absolutely. And we saw during the pandemic that students who couldn't go and study abroad, many institutions immediately readapted and pivoted to virtual study abroad. And so the creativity around those, I think, and also the technology platforms and infrastructure have evolved and in so many ways that I think we have that as an option. The other piece that we talked about is really the notion of internationalization at home. Many of us live in cities where we have communities that are from all around the world. There are opportunities to do community-based learning in those communities. There are opportunities to learn languages in so many other ways. And so our ability to leverage the communities that are around and surrounding universities become another important tool for how we think about it. And then lastly, the curriculum. We have to continue to enhance our curriculum so that we can continue to enhance learning for all students. Those who cannot leave for myriad of reasons, including sometimes medical and otherwise, financial, to those who have other reasons for why they can't leave. The curriculum is at the heart of the education. And the more we can refresh and renew our curriculum, the more we can then in many ways try to advance the goals of internationalization in curricular ways. And then lastly, faculty. Hire more international faculty that are coming into your classrooms. So that it's not your students who are necessarily leaving the country, but that faculty member can in many ways have impact with 25 to 75 students because of the number of classes that they're teaching. That's another way in which you can promote and you can advance internationalization.
Exactly. I'm so glad that you mentioned the faculty piece. The other thing that I heard from some graduate students over the years, actually, the similar idea is that when we are talking about a topic, oftentimes we want to hear the global perspective from the faculty. Yes, we can bring it to the classroom. But I think they would like to see more emphasis on that. And then, yes, bringing international faculty is kind of solving half of the problem right there.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you, Fanta. Now, the next question is, more than half of all international students are from China or India. Would you respond to how this concentration of students from two countries fits into the aspect of diversity in international students in the United States? Thank you in advance. This question actually comes from Voice of America.
Okay. So I will say two things about this. Certainly, it would be great if we had more nationalities. And the fact that we have 50 or more % of overall students coming from two countries, certainly I think has some potential limits. And so I would say, and I would invite institutions to really continue to make sure that they're diversified in terms of nationality. Now, with that said, let me also preface this. Even in China, there's tremendous diversity. And same thing with India, right? And so once again, we should not be caught in thinking of a monolithic way, even within the countries that we've talked about, right? As you move from one province in China to another, you see the sheer diversity. I haven't been to China many times, I've seen it. India, same thing. And so my answer to that is, yes, we have two source countries. We need to diversify more in terms of nation states. But even with those two countries, we should not assume that all students who come from there are the same, because we're not.
They're not. Absolutely. Which you started saying in the beginning of your talk. Thank you. The next question is, VP Aw, thanks for saying double down in global education during this critical time. We need more leaders advocating the value of international education. In your view, what are some areas US institutions should invest on to revive inbound and outbound student mobility for the next 5 years?
Well, first and foremost, you have to get your name out there. And in order to get your name out there, you have to have strategic international recruitment strategy. You have to have that.
Yeah.
So I would say this is not the time to think about reduction of staffing in those areas, because again, as we said, in order to see the outcomes from it, it takes several years to see those outcomes. You have to build those relationships, and you have to have a sustained presence in specific areas for this to work. So that's one thing. Our recruitment efforts should not stop. Now, because of COVID, we went virtual and so forth, but whenever we can get out there, we want to be able to get out there. That's some of the things. Our alumni, they're still there. So our ability to engage the alumni community globally becomes incredibly important. They're incredible ambassadors for our institutions and want to make sure that they do that. We're going to have to continue to look at this cost issue. And it has to do with our financial aid model. I know it's incredibly challenging. I know it's been very challenging for us here at American University, but it is one of those things that we have to pay attention to. And so as we're thinking of campaigns, such as our major campaign that's coming up, we have to carve out a space for how do we raise more funds to be able to support international students. At the graduate student level, international students come from all around the world, and they come with tremendous credentials and compete very well with domestic students for all sorts of majors and things. So there's still a little bit more funding that's available there, but not as much at the undergraduate level. So we need to be thinking about how we fundraise. That's another part of the work that I think needs to happen during this period of time.
I want to go back to what you said about alumni. The other benefit of connecting with alumni is because this is a whole circle, right? People, parents, or students themselves make a huge investment.
Yes, they do.
Right?
Yes.
And then what is the rate of returning investment?
Absolutely.
So if we are connecting undergraduate students who never had any work experience in their home countries with the prominent alumni in their countries or workplaces while they are at our institutions, can you imagine the benefit? Or the increase in the rate?
Absolutely.
No,
there's no doubt.
There's no doubt. I think it's an emerging area, but I think the more we can put an emphasis on that,
absolutely,
the better.
Well, because it's an incredibly important professional network, right? It's an important professional network that is being created, I think, for students while they're here. And also, it may give potential for internships.
Absolutely.
Abroad and other opportunities. So I agree with you that connection with the alumni has a multiplier effect on many levels.
True. Thank you, Fanta. The fourth question, Dr. Aw, I really like your point of view regarding re-evaluating curriculum due to COVID. What do you think about re-evaluating support for international students? Even if the institutions bring more international students, they have to do something to retain them.
Great question. And you bring up now this other piece, which is diversity is not enough. Equity and inclusions are critically important. You can bring a diverse group of international students, but if the structure and the infrastructure is not there to support, you're going to have a revolving door. And so I can certainly appreciate this question on lots of levels. And what I would say is that the same services that we currently have on our campuses, whether it's your career services, whether it's your mental health services, whether it's your academic support, your writing center, you name it, you will want to make sure that there's the level of cultural competence that those who have been charged with providing services have. The same way we talk about the importance of cultural competence in diversity and inclusion, it's the same level of competence that you need in order to effectively support international students. And I think International Student and Scholar Services Office play an important key role in that, in ensuring that there's cross-cultural exchanges that are going on, and that the institution is continuing to pay attention to how we not only recruit, but how we support, retain, and also graduate international students. That is an important part of the work of support that has to happen.
Exactly. One statistic that I know is kind of a norm. Students come here very excited.
Yes.
So their excitement, their idea of belonging is very high.
Yeah.
And then parallel to the support that they receive, either that goes up
It goes down.
or stays the same.
Yeah.
Or goes down.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And Senem, what you've just described, we see this on the domestic front as well, right? This whole piece of sense of belonging, when you're not in the majority, is something that we see on our campuses again and again on so many levels. And so our ability for our institutions to not assume that you're bringing students for them to fit in and assimilate, but in fact that you're bringing students and that there needs to be an acculturation of the institution as a whole is really, I think, one of the shifts that we have to make institutionally.
Thank you. The last question, and I think time-wise we are doing well. We have 10 more minutes. The last question is, thank you for this conversation. What best practices can you share in ensuring buy-in from partners on campus when promoting internationalization at home? That's a very important question.
I think it's a
Yes.
great question.
Yeah.
And I would say there's two ways we think about that. One is that, again, internationalization at home starts with the curriculum. And you have to do an assessment of the curriculum, and you have to be able to work with the faculty. And you have to be able to make the value proposition to faculty for why that matters. Concrete example of that is we have seen in community-based learning, we have seen students who are going out into communities, and these are incredibly diverse communities, and many of them tend to be immigrant communities, right? That's an example of where you're leveraging it from a curricular perspective, and you're leveraging the city that you're in to do that. So my first invitation to say, in order to get buy-in, you must work with your faculty. You have to get the faculty to buy in and to understand what is the educational merit of this in order to be able to kind of affect internationalization. And sometimes what it takes is that one faculty member who is your champion. And in becoming your champion, you want to make sure that they're telling that story to other faculty members. And your role then as an institution is to create the infrastructure for how to facilitate that. Because faculty will be incredibly discouraged if there are too many barriers. So you have to, in many ways, ease those barriers for faculty to be able to then be able to kind of do the work that is needed there.
And maybe sharing best practices and definitely persistence.
There is no doubt that persistence is important. Whether you have a Center for Teaching, Research, and Learning, they should submit proposals and talk to other faculty members. Those become important. But then also the institution has to be very intentional in stating that, for example, community-based learning is considered integral learning for your institution. It has to start from that level. It has to be mission critical for it to start.
Thank you, Fanta. These are the questions. I would like to stop now and see if you have last words. I mean, let me see. One more question, Jill. I'm sorry, I spoke too soon. In preparing international students for success in today's environment, what do you think adaptation programs should incorporate or focus on? Any preferred modalities, in parentheses, adaptation courses, online modules, group sessions?
It's a great question. And I kind of think we need to be thinking about the life cycle for international students and when to introduce learning, and particularly cross-cultural learning, for what that transition looks like. I think what COVID has taught us is the fact that we have access to more platforms for delivery of learning. I would encourage us to think about even how do we start that earlier than before even the student arrives, right? And that we don't have to wait until the student actually gets to our campus for us to first have those introduction. The more we can start to prepare students for what they can confront when they first get here, and the more we can have that as staggered learning and scaffolding learning, I think the better it is. I often say one of the things that we often do, I think all of us in orientation, and students, and I remember coming as an international student, it's like drinking from a fire hose. We do that with international and domestic students because we want to make sure that they're equipped for what that is, but they need time to absorb that learning. And so we need to stretch that timetable a bit more. So our ability to use virtual, to then use face-to-face once they get here, and then figure out reinforcement during their first semester would be all the things that kind of come to mind for me from just the student development side of this as well.
I will also share again from the same conference, Education USA conference, where I heard from, I don't remember which react was that, but they said, show, not tell.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's exactly what you are saying, pre-arrival, so
Absolutely.
showing more,
Absolutely.
sharing more.
Absolutely. And I think also this idea of showing and not telling is learning by doing.
Absolutely.
We absorb that learning much more effectively
Yeah.
than if we're just sort of having the conversation.
Thank you so much. And I think this concludes our questions from the audience. And I would like to give you the last word again, if anything else that you would like to share.
Well, again, thank you for this conversation, Senem, because I think you as well was an international student. So I think you certainly understand the benefit of the educational system and how that plays into the work. What I will say, I think, to all of our colleagues and to any international student or scholar who's also listening in, this is a time for us to be hopeful. This is a time to do some things differently. I think for a lot of us who were very concerned with the pandemic, that this would be in some ways a devastating impact. And I think the data is promising. But with the data being promising, we really cannot rest on our laurels. This is a time to really embrace change in different ways. And so that's the first thing that I would say, is that we have an opportunity to engage in international education and internationalization in very different ways. Two, there's an opportunity to marry diversity, equity, and inclusion and internationalization. These are not two completely separate entities. I think there's some points of intersection. And I think I would encourage our institutions to do more of that work as we move forward. That would be the second thing that I would say. The third thing is, for those who are in the work of international education, it is the work of the head and the heart. And the heart matters tremendously in this work. I have seen so many people who've dedicated their careers and their lives to this work because we believe in the transformational power of education and learning. That, I think, is what keeps many of us motivated to continue to do the work. And so my hat is off to all of those who are in the field, particularly as we're celebrating International Education Week. This is not just a career, it's a vocation. Whenever we have the ability to impact one life or more, and we have the ability to be both educators and learners, I think that is probably the greatest gift we're given. And so that's the other piece that I will leave in sort of our conversation today. But I leave really much more hopeful, much more hopeful.
We will end this on a good note. Hope is always the good thing. Hope is how we can keep going, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this.
Well,
this
thank
was
you.
wonderful. Thank you for the audience, thank you for all the support that we received from our own teams.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And to everyone out there, because we have literally people from around the world who are joining us. For some it's morning, for some it's midday, and for some it's evening. But for everyone, hope please be safe and hope you're well.
And by the way, I have to tell you, we are hearing from a lot of our former students from around the world. They are sending hugs and love. Caitlin, for example,
oh my
Lori,
goodness. Oh my goodness.
I just wanted to mention.
Well, and I think what I will say back to them is one of the things that has been a pure joy for me in my work has been teaching and in the classroom. And part of the reason I'm particularly hopeful is because I've seen the next generation of international educators. And I think our future is tremendously bright.
Absolutely.
Because they're coming into the field with both head and heart, but they're coming into a field that is evolving and changing rapidly. And so that's another reason why I'm so excited about the field and the work. So my thanks to all of them and for the opportunity to re-engage with them.
All right. Thank you so much, Fanta. Thank you.